This is an amendment to restore some sanity and common sense to the executive pay practices that have outraged all of us that we have seen on Wall Street among the biggest financial institutions in this country. It's very simple and straightforward. It encourages large banks and financial institutions to adopt widely accepted and sound compensation practices. Banks, under this amendment, that would fail to adopt those standards would lose the benefit of certain tax deductions, like the tax deduction of their executive compensation as a cost of doing business over $1 million per executive. In other words, they could no longer deduct the large compensation payments that they make to highly paid employees. But we don't limit it to $1 million compensation. The bank could pay whatever it wanted. We're just going to get some common sense practices in here. Mr. President, with the status of financial reform legislation uncertain, I believe that we're going to have to deal with this issue immediately. And because of the angst in the country, I think all of us have read with astonishment the recent reports that Wall Street banks continue to pay outlandish bonuses to the executives that may not be so deserving. And then, just to add insult to the injury to the American taxpayer, many of those institutions are still living on taxpayer-funded life support. In most business professions, pay for executives should chase performance. Managers and executives are rewarded for creating lasting value to their company. Unsuccessful managers and executives are shown the door. But these basic common sense principles have been lost in these major Wall Street financial institutions that we have seen uncovered over the last several months. This year, total Wall Street bonuses exceeded $20 billion. In less than a year and a half after the fall of Lehman Brothers, it's back to business as usual for some of our major banks. And that is inexcusable. We've been here before. We've had this same debate, Mr. President, last spring. Remember when AIG paid absurd bonuses to financial traders that had managed one major accomplishment? And what was that accomplishment? They drove their company into the ground. And although we talked and talked out here on the floor of the Senate and legislation was introduced, Congress failed to act back then a year ago, and here we are again. Well, Mr. President, there's an old saying that comes to mind. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And so if we're going to right this financial ship of state, we're going to have to tackle all of the flaws in our financial system, and that includes executive pay, and executive pay specifically on Wall Street. There is now almost unanimous recognition that poorly crafted executive pay practices at major banks and financial institutions contributed to the near collapse of the financial system and the need that we had to step up to that almost caused financial meltdown the need of a $700 billion taxpayer-funded bailout called TARP, Toxic Assets Relief Program. Now think, just last week, the General Counsel of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors testified that the compensation practices in the banking sector were a contributing cause to the crisis. And in January, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, found that, quote, excessive and imprudent risk-taking remains a contributing factor in the financial institution failures and losses to the Deposit Insurance Fund. End of quote. The FDIC attributes these continuing failures and losses in part to bank compensation practices. Current pay practices encourage this excessive risk-taking because short-term gains are heavily rewarded even if they're unsustainable. And the negative consequences of severe losses are often externalized and shifted to the shareholders, and ultimately, when we have to bail them out, to the public taxpayers. The federal safety net for financial institutions encourages traders and executives to take unnecessary risk. And the most obvious example is the $700 billion Wall Street bailout, which I and other senators here initially opposed. Executives that should have been left without their shirts instead were left with golden parachutes. And so what we find is that Wall Street all too often has rewarded failure with bloated bonuses and outrageous severance packages. So if we want to get to real and meaningful financial reform, it's going to have to include changes in the existing compensation culture in the financial industry. And so the amendment that I'm offering is going to put an end to the reality disconnect on that street known as Wall Street that has rewarded failure and that emphasizes short-term stock appreciation over long-term growth. And this amendment does so by putting some basic and well-accepted principles of sound compensation practices in the tax code. And finally, this amendment that I'm going to offer creates new and meaningful executive compensation disclosure requirements so that shareholders can be empowered and investors can be empowered to hold banks accountable for compensation practices that fail to fully comply with these new tax rules that are there by virtue of the principles adopted. Mr. President, of course, the special interests are going to come in and argue that Congress should not get involved in compensation decisions, that the market knows best. They'll argue if Congress passes measures like this that Wall Street's going to pack up its bags and it's going to move to greener pastures abroad. Unfortunately, right now, what the market knows is that big short-term gains lead to big bonuses and big losses lead to taxpayer-funded bailouts. And the American taxpayer is fed up. Mr. President, this is only going to apply to the largest 57 banks in this country. This is not going to apply to most of the banks in this country. We need to take real steps now to reform compensation practices And it's my hope that the chairman of the Finance Committee is going to be able to get this amendment accepted without opposition. It's common sense. It's desperately needed, and the American people are crying out for reform.